Subscribe to Dr. Nightmare Channel now.
Story 1. The Garage in the Dark. When I moved back into my parents' old farmhouse after years away, I thought the worst I'd have to deal with was the loneliness. The place sat at the end of a narrow gravel road outside the small town of Ashwick, surrounded by empty fields and a stretch of woods that looked darker than pitch once the sun dropped. It had been in my family for 3 generations, and though time had worn the paint and warped the windows, it still felt like home. At least, it did at first. My older brother, Daniel, had once shared a bedroom with me in that house. 2 narrow beds, the smell of old pine from the wooden floorboards, and the faint draft that always seemed to whistle through the cracks in the window. When he left for college, I claimed the room for myself, pushing his bed out and rearranging everything the way I liked. It felt like finally having space to breathe. Years later, when I came back after finishing school, Daniel had already returned and taken it back. My parents suggested I stay in the old guest room upstairs, a much smaller space, perched directly above the garage. That room always felt odd to me. The way it overhung the garage made the floor vibrate whenever the heavy door below creaked open. 2 narrow windows sat on opposite walls, one facing the gravel drive, the other peering into the side yard where the woods pressed close. It was the kind of room that always seemed too quiet, like sound didn't carry right in there. But it was private, and at the time, I didn't mind. One Friday night, when everyone was gone, Daniel at a conference, my parents at their lake cabin for the weekend, I found myself entirely alone in that big, echoing farmhouse. The silence was comforting at first. I had spent the evening with a book propped on my knees, the old lamp at my bedside casting a warm glow across the cramped little room. The crickets outside sang in their endless chorus, the only sound breaking the stillness. Then, close to midnight, the floor trembled. It was so subtle at first that I thought I imagined it, but within seconds I recognized the deep, groaning rumble. The garage door was rising. My heart skipped. Nobody was supposed to be home. My parents had told me they wouldn't be back until Sunday, and Daniel wasn't due until the next afternoon. I dropped the book and ran to the window, peering out toward the driveway. The motion light hadn't turned on, and the gravel looked empty in the darkness, but the garage door below me was unmistakably open. The air felt colder suddenly, the kind of chill that seeps through bone when you know something is wrong. For a moment, I convinced myself it might have been a mechanical glitch. That old door had a mind of its own sometimes. But then I heard voices, faint, muffled, drifting up through the floorboards. I froze, straining to listen. 2 voices at least, male. Low, steady tones, the kind of calm speaking that didn't sound like thieves in a rush. They were in the back of the house, toward my parents' bedroom. I should have hidden. I should have stayed where I was and called for help, but something in me wouldn't allow it. My chest throbbed with adrenaline, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Still, I found myself opening the closet door and pulling out the old aluminum baseball bat I hadn't touched since high school. Phone in one hand, bat in the other, I crept down the stairs. The old steps groaned beneath my weight, each sound booming like a gunshot in the silence. My breath was shallow, ragged. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispered the address, and tucked the phone in my pocket with the line still open. The operator told me not to move, but I barely heard her through the blood pounding in my ears. The voices grew clearer as I neared the hallway leading to my parents' bedroom. I could hear drawers sliding, hangers rattling, deliberate movements, as though they weren't worried about being caught. I tightened my grip on the bat. I don't know what possessed me, but I burst into the doorway yelling at the top of my lungs. Two men spun around, startled. One was tall and broad, wearing a dark hoodie, his face shadowed in the lamplight. The other, thinner, crouched by my mother's closet with a jewelry box in his hands. They hadn't expected anyone home. I saw it in their eyes, wide and shining in the lamplight. I swung the bat hard at the thin one, catching his leg. He collapsed with a cry. Before I could swing again, the larger man lunged, tackling me. We crashed to the floor. His strength was overwhelming. He wrestled the bat from my hands as if I were a child. His fingers clamped around my throat, squeezing until spots danced in my vision. I thrashed, clawing at him, gasping for air. The thin man crawled toward me, something glinting in his hand. A knife. Cold terror flooded me. I knew then that I wasn't going to survive. Somewhere outside, faint but growing, came the wail of sirens. The large man snarled and swung the bat once, hard. White-hot pain exploded in my skull, and the world went black. When I woke, I was on the floor, my head pounding like it had split open. A police officer crouched over me, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The back door stood wide open, curtains flapping in the night breeze. The intruders were gone. I should have felt relief, but what came instead was dread, because as the officers moved through the house, I realized something chilling. Every door had been locked. The only way in had been through the garage, and the only people who knew about the button in my car that opened it were my family. For days afterwards, that thought gnawed at me. Whoever came into our home didn't choose it randomly. They knew where the opener was kept. They knew when my family would be gone, and they knew enough about me to come that night when I was alone. We changed the locks. We installed cameras, alarms, lights that blasted on at the faintest motion. But no one was ever caught. And deep down, I don't think it was about burglary at all. Because when I close my eyes at night, I still see the thin man crawling toward me, knife glinting, and the cold certainty that they weren't just looking for valuables. They were looking for me. Story 2. The Call from Mercy Hill. It was late autumn when I moved back to the town of Mercy Hill, a quiet place where the streets curled around old oaks and the houses all seemed to creak with memory. I hadn't wanted to return. The only reason I did was my mother. Her health had been faltering, nothing catastrophic, but she had begun to stumble more often, forgetting simple things, insisting she was fine when she clearly wasn't. I found a small duplex a few miles from her house, modest and a little run down, but it was perfect for me. I told myself it would only be temporary, that I'd help her until she either got stronger or until I had no choice but to face worse decisions. The duplex was quiet, too quiet. My neighbors kept to themselves, and the walls seemed to swallow sound. At night, I would sit on the couch with the TV playing low, the hum of the refrigerator the only other noise. It was loneliness that felt almost physical, pressing against me from the darkened corners. One evening, around 9:15, as I was half watching the local news, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something made me swipe the screen. Hello? The voice on the other end was calm, professional. A woman introducing herself as a nurse from St. Alden's emergency department. She told me my mother had been admitted after falling at home. She had hit her head, she said, but she was conscious, asking for me. Could I come right away? The breath left my lungs. My mother's name, her address, even the mention of her hip replacement. The nurse knew it all. There was no reason for me to doubt her. I grabbed my keys without thinking. I didn't bother locking the door as I pulled it shut behind me, heart thudding as I sped to the car. The drive through Mercy Hill was a blur, traffic lights bleeding red through the windshield, the skeletal trees leaning close over the road. At the hospital, I rushed to the front desk, stumbling over my words as I gave my mother's name. The receptionist frowned, typing quickly. Then she looked at me with the kind of careful sympathy that made my stomach drop. "No one by that name has been admitted tonight," she said gently. I froze. There has to be some mistake. I got a call. A nurse told me she'd been brought in an hour ago. The receptionist shook her head. No record, no nurse by that name on staff. My fingers shook as I dialed my mother's landline. She answered groggily, confused as to why I was calling so late. She was fine, she said. She hadn't fallen, hadn't even left her bed. The realization hit me like ice water. Someone had lied to me, deliberately, to get me out of my house. I bolted back to the car, flooring it down the empty streets. My duplex sat dark and still when I pulled in. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe I had overreacted, but the moment I opened the door, I knew. The air inside was wrong, disturbed, unsettled, as if strangers had exhaled in every corner. Drawers gaped open, cushions lay slashed across the floor. My TV was gone, my laptop missing. But that wasn't what made my knees weaken. The intruders had taken strange things. The framed photographs on my shelves emptied of their pictures, the glass left behind, the medicine bottles from my bathroom cabinet, a box of old letters I'd kept from high school, torn open and scattered. They hadn't stolen for money. They had stolen from me, pieces of me. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained. Officers came, their flashlights carving through the rooms. They took notes, asked questions, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't understand. To them, it was just another break-in. But I couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. Whoever it was hadn't just known my number or my mother's name. They had known her medical history. They had known my fears, and they used them like keys. For weeks, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made me jolt awake, convinced someone was outside watching. My mother brushed it off, told me I was paranoid, but she didn't see what I saw when I closed my eyes. Faceless figures leafing through my photographs, memorizing my life. I bought cameras, motion lights, alarms. Still, some nights I swear I hear the phone ringing faintly in the silence, even when it isn't. And sometimes I imagine what would have happened if I had stayed home that night instead of running to the hospital. Maybe they weren't just after memories. Maybe they wanted me too. Story 3: The Man at Hollow Creek. I had only been living at the house on Hollow Creek Lane for 7 months when it happened. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom rental tucked at the edge of town, its shingles worn and its porch sagging, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I had a place that felt stable, where I could cook dinner in peace, leave my books scattered on the coffee table, and fall asleep without the noise of thin apartment walls. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly retirees and a few young families. Nights were still. Sometimes I could hear the creek trickling faintly beyond the trees, but otherwise, silence stretched for miles. I told myself I liked it, that the solitude was comforting. It was a Thursday night, just past 11, when the pounding began. Not knocking, pounding. heavy fists slamming against the front door with such force that the frame rattled. I froze halfway down the hall, my phone still in hand from scrolling mindlessly before bed. The porch light was dim and useless, casting only shadows when I tried peeking through the curtain. Still, I could make out a figure, a man shifting from foot to foot, his movements jerky, desperate. Against my better judgment, I opened the main door while keeping the screen locked. The man was maybe mid-30s, disheveled, eyes wild with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He reeked of sweat and stale clothes, as if he had been sleeping rough for weeks. His voice came out ragged, nearly a growl. "You're in my house. Open the door. This is my place. You don't belong here." At first, I thought he was drunk, maybe high. But then he began listing details, things he shouldn't have known. He talked about the master bedroom, how the door hit the bathroom wall when you opened it too far, about the back entrance that stuck unless you lifted the knob just right, about the faint stain on the hallway carpet shaped almost like a handprint. My blood turned to ice. Those were things you'd only know if you had lived here. He wasn't finished. From a worn folder tucked under his arm, he produced documents. A lease agreement dated the year before I moved in, with his name scrawled across the signature line. Then came envelopes, bills addressed to him, stamped with this very address. And then, worst of all, photographs. I pressed closer to the screen door as he fanned them out. They weren't old snapshots yellowed with time. They looked recent, too recent. One showed him sitting on the very couch where I had been reading hours earlier. Another captured him standing at the stove, cooking. Others showed people I didn't recognize, strangers smiling at the kitchen table, fireworks boxes stacked on the counter, laughter frozen in time. The walls seemed to close in on me. None of it made sense. I knew I had lived here alone since moving in. I knew I hadn't hosted anyone, let alone the strangers grinning from those photographs. But the images were too sharp, too detailed to dismiss. I told him I would call the police, and just like that, his fury vanished. His breathing slowed, his eyes narrowed, and he gave me a smile so calm it was worse than his rage. "Go ahead," he said softly. "I'll wait." Then he turned, stepped off the porch, and melted into the darkness. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They told me not to worry, that it was probably some vagrant playing tricks, maybe suffering from delusions. They didn't even look at the photos he'd shown me. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. The way the wallpaper and the background of those shots matched exactly. The way my coffee mug appeared in one frame sitting on the table where I had left it that morning. 2 weeks later, I came home to find the place ransacked. Not like a burglary where valuables vanish. My laptop and TV were untouched. Instead, drawers were pulled out, closets emptied, boxes overturned, as though someone had been searching. No sign of forced entry, the locks unbroken, which meant whoever had come in had a key. I called the landlord in a panic. He swore he hadn't given keys to anyone else. He even changed the locks the next day, but I could see the worry flicker across his face. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't been lying, that, in some twisted way, this really had been his house. Maybe not in the legal sense, but in some other claim I couldn't begin to understand. Sometimes I wonder if he lived here in another time, another life, if those photographs weren't just fakes, but windows into something I was never supposed to see. The police told me to move on. The landlord said the locks would keep me safe, but whenever the house settles and the floorboards creak, I hear his voice in the back of my head, calm and certain. This is my place. You don't belong here. And deep down, I'm not sure he was wrong.